History often remembers the moment the first shot is fired, but far less often does it remember why the gun was already loaded. Before the world plunged into the catastrophe of World War I, there was a quieter conflict on the edge of Europe and North Africa, one that reshaped alliances, ambitions, and expectations. Tonight's story begins with a question historians still debate. Can a seemingly limited war prepare the ground for a global one? In 1911, Italy and the Ottoman Empire clashed over distant territories, in a conflict many dismissed as short, contained, and peripheral. Yet beneath the surface, this war tested new military strategies, exposed imperial weakness, and sent a clear message to rival powers watching closely from afar. The balance of power trembled not because the world was ready to collapse, but because it was learning how easily it could. This is not a story of a single spark lighting the fuse of World War I. It is a story about precedent, about confidence gained and fear awakened, about leaders who believed limited wars could be controlled, and nations who learned that modern conflict no longer respected borders or intentions. The Italo-Turkish War did not start the great catastrophe of the 20th century, but it showed how fragile peace had already become. As we unfold this forgotten prelude, we will explore how ambition, miscalculation, and opportunity quietly rewrote the rules of warfare. You will see how events in North Africa echoed across Europe, influencing decisions that would soon shape the fate of millions. If you are fascinated by the hidden connections of history, the moments that do not make headlines but change everything, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future episodes. Now, let us step back to a war few remember, and discover why its consequences were far greater than anyone expected. What followed the Italo-Turkish War was not the sound of a world collapsing, but something far more subtle and, in many, more dangerous: the quiet normalization of tension. When the guns fell silent in 1912, Europe did not erupt into chaos. Trains still ran, markets still opened, and diplomats returned to their desks convinced that the international system had proven its resilience. Yet beneath that appearance of stability, assumptions had shifted in ways few fully understood at the time. The conflict between Italy and the Ottoman Empire did not redraw the map of Europe, nor did it unleash an immediate chain reaction among the great powers. Instead, it altered expectations. Italy's swift action demonstrated that war could still be used as a tool of national ambition without triggering a general catastrophe. Observers in Vienna, Berlin, Paris, and St. Petersburg took note. The lesson was not that war was inevitable, but that it could be limited, managed, and contained, an illusion that would prove devastating only a few years later. At the same time, the war exposed vulnerabilities that others could not ignore. The Ottoman Empire, long regarded as fragile yet persistent, appeared unable to defend its distant territories against a determined European challenger. This perception mattered deeply in the Balkans, where neighboring states watched closely and drew their own conclusions. If a great empire could be pressured and weakened without consequence, then perhaps long-held grievances could finally be settled by force. The result was not immediate rebellion, but a growing sense that the old restraints on action no longer applied. Technological and tactical developments also left a lasting impression. New weapons, aerial reconnaissance, and modern logistics were tested in ways that felt experimental rather than alarming. Military planners across Europe studied these developments with professional interest, focusing on efficiency and innovation rather than the broader implications. War began to seem less like a last resort and more like a calculated risk, something that could be planned, optimized, and won quickly if executed with precision. Diplomatically, the aftermath of the conflict revealed another dangerous shift. The major powers protested, negotiated, and maneuvered, but ultimately accepted the outcome. No collective effort emerged to discourage similar actions in the future. This silence was not agreement, but it functioned like permission. Each power filed away the memory of the war, adding it to a growing archive of precedents that suggested bold moves might succeed if timed correctly and framed carefully. By the time Europe moved closer to 1914, the Italo-Turkish War had already done its work, not as a cause, but as a conditioning experience. It had not lit the fire, but it had dried the wood. Leaders and generals did not march toward catastrophe because of what happened in Libya, but because conflicts like it had reshaped their understanding of risk, response, and restraint. The international system was still standing, but it had learned the wrong lessons about its own strength. In this way, the war's true legacy lies in what it taught those who watched from afar. It showed that tension could rise without immediate disaster, that empires could be challenged without universal retaliation, and that the cost of miscalculation might be delayed rather than avoided. When the final crisis came in the summer of 1914, it did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a world already accustomed to pressure, already testing its limits, and already convinced that the next conflict, like the last, could be controlled. In the years that followed, the Italo-Turkish War faded quickly from public memory, overshadowed by far greater events that would soon consume Europe. Yet its disappearance from popular history does not reflect its importance. Instead, it marks how quietly the conflict did its work, reshaping political calculations and military thinking across Europe and the Mediterranean without ever demanding the world's full attention. What made it so influential was not its scale, but its timing, arriving at a moment when old empires were weakening and new ambitions were pressing against long-established boundaries. For Italy, the war was a declaration of arrival. Still a relatively young nation, it sought recognition as a modern power capable of overseas expansion. Its success sent a signal far beyond North Africa. To rivals and allies alike, Italy appeared confident, assertive, and willing to act when opportunity presented itself. This perception mattered in diplomatic circles, where status and credibility often carried as much weight as treaties. Italy's actions suggested that restraint was no longer the only path to legitimacy, subtly encouraging others to reconsider how they might pursue their own ambitions. Across the Mediterranean, the consequences were even more profound. The Ottoman Empire's loss of territory reinforced the image of a power struggling to defend its far-reaching domains. While this decline had been discussed for decades, the war gave it fresh urgency. Regional actors began to view Ottoman control not as an unchangeable fact, but as a temporary condition. In the Balkans, this shift in perception fed a sense of possibility, strengthening the belief that long-standing claims could be advanced through decisive action, rather than prolonged negotiation. Military institutions also absorbed lessons that would linger long after the conflict ended. The war demonstrated how rapidly modern forces could be deployed across sea and desert, and how new technologies could be integrated into conventional campaigns. Officers studied these developments carefully, not as warnings, but as opportunities. The emphasis fell on adaptation and efficiency, reinforcing the idea that future wars would be short, calculated, and manageable. Few paused to consider how such confidence might collapse under the strain of a larger confrontation. Politically, the war unfolded in a climate of uneasy observation. Europe's major powers monitored events closely, yet stopped short of meaningful intervention. Their restraint created an unspoken understanding that certain actions, once considered too risky, might now be tolerated if they did not directly threaten the balance among the great powers. This understanding did not produce immediate conflict, but it loosened the framework that had kept rivalries in check. Each crisis that passed without consequence made the next one easier to imagine. As the narrative of European stability continued, the Italo-Turkish War settled into the background, remembered only by specialists and those directly affected. but its influence endured in the mindset of leaders who had watched it unfold. It became part of a pattern, a series of experiences that suggested the international system could absorb shocks without collapsing. This belief, reinforced again and again in the years before 1914, encouraged a dangerous complacency. When viewed in isolation, the war appears limited and distant. When placed within the broader story of the early 20th century, it emerges as a quiet prelude, shaping expectations and lowering thresholds across an already strained political landscape. It did not announce the coming storm, but it taught Europe how to stand in gathering winds, unaware that the calm it preserved was already fragile. As the story of the Italo-Turkish War unfolds, one theme remains constant: the need for restraint when assigning blame in history. This is where the voice of scholarship becomes essential, not as a barrier to understanding, but as a guide that prevents the past from being reduced to simple chains of cause and effect. The quotation drawn from Cacamo's work serves precisely this purpose, reminding us that history rarely moves in straight lines and that responsibility, when examined closely, tends to disperse rather than concentrate. Cacamo's caution does not weaken the significance of the war. Instead, it sharpens it, by refusing to label the conflict as the spark that ignited a global catastrophe. The analysis forces us to look deeper, beyond the comfort of clear beginnings and endings. The Italo-Turkish War did not pull Europe into immediate chaos, and it did not compel the great powers to mobilize their armies. What it did, far more quietly, was influence how those powers understood risk, opportunity, and consequence. This distinction matters because it shifts our attention from events themselves to the interpretations that followed. In the years before 1914, European leaders did not act in ignorance of history. They acted under the influence of recent experience. Conflicts like the Italo-Turkish War suggested that bold action could be taken without triggering universal disaster. Each time this assumption appeared to hold true, it gained credibility. Cacamo's insistence on careful causality challenges the temptation to retroactively assign inevitability to later events. It reminds us that the choices of 1914 were shaped by a series of interpretations, not by a single decisive moment. This approach also guards against another common distortion: the belief that structural tensions alone are sufficient to explain catastrophe. Empires were strained, alliances were rigid, and rivalries were intense, yet these conditions had existed for years. What changed was how decision-makers read those conditions. The war between Italy and the Ottoman Empire became one of several reference points, a case study quietly filed away in the minds of diplomats and generals. It suggested that the system could endure shocks, that escalation could be managed, and that restraint by others could be assumed. By grounding this narrative in scholarly caution, the documentary resists turning the past into a moral fable with clear villains and heroes. Instead, it presents history as a landscape shaped by perception, misjudgment, and incomplete information. Cacamo's words function as a reminder that assigning responsibility requires more than identifying who fired first or who benefited most. It requires understanding how ideas about power and limitation evolved over time. This perspective brings coherence to the broader story. The Italo-Turkish War emerges not as an isolated anomaly, nor as a direct cause of world war, but as part of a gradual transformation in how conflict was understood. The war's significance lies in its influence on thinking rather than its immediate outcomes. It altered expectations, reinforced confidence in limited war, and contributed to an environment where caution slowly gave way to calculation. In the end, the scholarly voice does not distance us from the drama of history. It draws us closer to its complexity. By emphasizing evidence over simplification, it allows the war to assume its proper place in the narrative, not as a single turning point, but as one thread in a much larger tapestry of decisions and assumptions. Through this lens, the past becomes not a chain reaction, but a process one shaped as much by interpretation as by action. As the narrative reaches beyond events and analysis, it turns toward a deeper concern: the responsibility that comes with interpreting the causes of great wars. The creators do not treat history as a courtroom in search of a single culprit, but as a shared space of memory where conclusions must be handled with care. In telling the story of the Italo-Turkish War, they emphasize that how we explain the past can shape how we understand conflict itself, influencing whether future generations see war as inevitable, accidental, or avoidable. Historical responsibility begins with restraint. The temptation to simplify complex events into clear causes and consequences is strong, especially when looking back from the vantage point of known outcomes. World War I looms so large over the early 20th century that every preceding crisis risks being interpreted as a step toward it. The creators resist this pull, choosing instead to examine how contemporaries understood their own actions. By doing, they restore uncertainty to the past, reminding us that the people who lived through these moments did not possess the clarity hindsight provides. This approach also acknowledges the power of interpretation. When wars are framed as unavoidable results of earlier events, human choice fades into the background, decisions become reactions, and responsibility dissolves into fate. By contrast, a careful reading of the Italo-Turkish War highlights how leaders weighed options, misread signals, and learned lessons that were not inherently destructive but became dangerous when applied without reflection. The creators suggest that history's most consequential outcomes often emerge not from singular acts, but from patterns of thinking repeated over time. There is also an ethical dimension to this responsibility. Assigning blame carelessly can distort understanding and obscure the real dynamics at play. By avoiding the claim that this war directly caused World War I, the narrative preserves space to examine broader forces without overstating the role of any single conflict. This does not minimize the war's importance. Rather, it places it within a continuum where influence is subtle, cumulative, and often indirect. Such framing encourages viewers to engage with history as a process rather than a sequence of dramatic triggers. The creator's emphasis on responsibility extends to the present. How we talk about past wars shapes how we perceive current tensions. If history is presented as a chain of unavoidable escalations, it risks fostering resignation rather than understanding. By showing how interpretations formed, solidified, and sometimes missiled decision-makers before 1914, the narrative invites reflection on the role of judgment in times of uncertainty. It suggests that awareness of past misinterpretations can be as valuable as knowledge of past events. In connecting the Italo-Turkish War to the wider pre-war world, the story remains unified by this principle of care. Each analysis, whether political, military, or scholarly, feeds into a broader reminder that history demands humility. The creators do not claim final answers. Instead, they model a way of asking questions that respects complexity and resists oversimplification. This stance does not weaken the story's impact, but deepens it, allowing the past to speak in its full ambiguity. Ultimately, the emphasis on historical responsibility transforms the narrative from a recounting of events into a reflection on understanding itself. The war becomes more than a forgotten episode. It becomes a lesson in how easily meaning can be imposed where uncertainty once existed. By approaching causality with caution and respect, the creators affirm that studying history is not only about knowing what happened, but about recognizing how interpretations can shape both memory and meaning long after the fighting has ended. As the story draws together its many threads, the acknowledgments offered by the creators take on a meaning that goes beyond simple courtesy. By naming historians and researchers who supported the episode as production, the documentary quietly reinforces everything it has argued so far about responsibility, interpretation, and care in the telling of history. These acknowledgments are not an afterthought. They are part of the narrative itself, reminding the viewer that understanding the past is never the work of a single voice, but the result of sustained, collective effort. Throughout the exploration of the Italo-Turkish War, the narrative has emphasized caution in assigning causes and humility in drawing conclusions. The presence of scholars behind the scenes gives substance to that approach. Their work represents years spent examining archives, weighing competing interpretations, and resisting the temptation of simple explanations. By acknowledging this support openly, the creators signal that the story being told rests on dialogue rather than assertion, on debate rather than certainty. This collaborative foundation matters because the war itself has often been overlooked or simplified. Without careful research, it is easy to treat it as either insignificant or decisive, stripping it of its true complexity. The involvement of historians ensures that the conflict is presented in proportion, neither exaggerated nor dismissed. Their contributions help place the war within the broader political and military environment of the early 20th century, connecting it to shifting perceptions without forcing it into a predetermined narrative. The acknowledgements also highlight an important truth about historical storytelling. Accuracy is not achieved through isolation. Each insight builds on prior scholarship, and each interpretation is tested against evidence gathered by others. In recognizing this process, the documentary aligns its form with its message. Just as the causes of major wars cannot be reduced to a single event, historical understanding cannot emerge from a single perspective. It requires comparison, disagreement, and revision. By drawing attention to its sources and collaborators, the episode invites the audience into this process. It subtly encourages viewers to see history not as a fixed account delivered from above, but as an ongoing conversation shaped by new questions and careful reassessment. This openness strengthens trust, not because it claims authority, but because it reveals how that authority is constructed. The narrative becomes more credible precisely because it acknowledges its dependence on others. There is also a unifying effect at work. Earlier sections have explored how decision-makers before 1914 relied on recent experiences to guide their choices, sometimes drawing flawed conclusions from incomplete evidence. In contrast, the documentary's reliance on scholarly collaboration models an alternative approach, one grounded in patience and reflection. The contrast underscores a central theme: the difference between acting on assumption and understanding built through careful study. In this light, the acknowledgements serve as a quiet conclusion to the story's broader argument. They affirm that responsible history is not only about what is said, but about how it is produced. By recognizing the historians and researchers behind the episode, the creators reaffirm their commitment to nuance, accuracy, and respect for complexity. The war remains a forgotten prelude in popular memory, but through collective effort, it is restored to its rightful place in the larger tapestry of the past, understood not through simplification, but through shared inquiry and thoughtful interpretation. As the episode comes to a close, the final credits do more than mark the end of a program. They quietly reaffirm the values that have guided the entire journey. By clearly presenting sources, contributors, and academic references, the channel underscores its commitment to transparency and careful historical inquiry. This closing moment reflects the same principles that shaped the story from the beginning: respect for evidence, openness about interpretation, and an understanding that history gains strength when its foundations are visible. The Italo-Turkish War has been explored not as a dramatic turning point, but as a subtle force that influenced how nations thought about power, conflict, and restraint. Ending the episode with full credits reinforces that this interpretation did not emerge from speculation or convenience. It is the result of research, debate, and engagement with existing scholarship. In doing, the documentary reminds us that history is not simply told, it is built, piece by piece, through sources that can be examined, questioned, and revisited. This transparency matters because the subject itself resists simple conclusions. The war's legacy lies not in a single outcome, but in how it shaped perceptions across Europe and the Mediterranean. By openly acknowledging its academic grounding, the channel invites viewers to continue the conversation beyond the screen, to explore the sources themselves, and to approach history with curiosity rather than certainty. It is an invitation to think critically, to recognize complexity, and to appreciate how careful storytelling can illuminate even the most overlooked chapters of the past. As the final words fade, what remains is not just a summary of events, but a framework for understanding how history works. Conflicts are not isolated moments frozen in time. They are part of an evolving dialogue between action and interpretation. The episode's conclusion reinforces this idea, leaving the audience with a sense that the past is neither distant nor closed, but still speaking through the evidence we choose to examine and the questions we are willing to ask. Thank you for spending this time exploring history with us, for listening closely, and for engaging with stories that challenge easy answers. If you found this documentary meaningful and want to support thoughtful, well-sourced history content, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue uncovering the lesser-known stories that shape our understanding of the world. Until next time, thank you for watching, and for keeping the past alive through curiosity and reflection.